The wind rolled off the Montana plains in long, bitter waves as Grace Whitaker stepped out of her dusty sedan and onto the frost-bitten grass of Waverly Hollow. The sky above Elmridge was a pewter gray, streaked with low clouds that threatened snow by dusk. It was the kind of day that seeped into your bones, and the kind of day when most people would avoid buying a haunted-looking farm no one had touched in 4 decades. But Grace wasn't most people. She pulled her wool coat tighter around her, a hand-me-down from her late husband that still smelled faintly of cedar and tobacco, and looked toward the sagging silhouette of the farmhouse in the distance. Waverly Hollow had once been the pride of the Renshaw family, an estate whispered about in both admiration and unease. 90 acres of rolling hills, abandoned barns, and a sprawling 3-story home with shuttered windows and flaking blue paint. The place hadn't seen life since before Grace was born. "Tell me again why we're here, Mom?" Caleb's voice came from behind, dry and skeptical. He stood tall beside her, his boots crunching on frost, arms crossed over a flannel shirt too thin for the weather. Grace didn't answer right away. Her eyes lingered on the broken fence line and the auction sign half blown over by the wind. "Because I need this," she thought. "Because we need something that still has roots." "I need to try," she finally said. Caleb gave her a long look, and Grace saw the ache in his eyes. He hadn't been the same since Dan, her husband, his father, passed away in the spring. None of them had. Losing Dan had pulled the ground out from under their feet. Caleb dropped out of school. Sophie withdrew into her sketchbooks and photography, and Grace just tried to survive one day at a time. Being a high school English teacher turned part-time librarian wasn't exactly the retirement plan she and Dan had dreamed up together, but here they were, broke, grieving, drifting, and now betting what little was left of their future on a broken-down farmstead with more ghosts than neighbors. A car door slammed, drawing her attention to the small crowd gathering near a folding table at the edge of the field. Sophie appeared beside them, camera slung around her neck, her pale cheeks flushed pink from the cold. "Place gives me the creeps," she muttered, snapping a photo of the looming house, like something out of an abandoned history book. "Then it's perfect for us," Grace said, trying to muster a smile. They signed in, bidder number 12, and made their way to the small knot of people waiting in the field. Maybe a dozen all told. A pair of investors in sleek down jackets, a woman with a clipboard from the county assessor's office, and a few curious locals Grace recognized from town. But what caught her eye was the man standing stiffly near a black Suburban, his overcoat pristine, his expression unreadable. Roger Hale. She recognized him from town council meetings, always the first to vote against preservation projects and the first to support revitalization plans that involved bulldozers and condo units. If Hale was here, that meant he had corporate backing, and if he wanted Waverly Hollow, it wasn't for heritage. "Figures," Caleb muttered, following her gaze. "Hale doesn't show up unless there's money to be made." Grace said nothing. Instead, she looked back at the farmhouse. The place had a gravity to it. She felt it in her chest the moment she saw the listing online. Grainy black and white photos from the 70s, a single sentence, "Foreclosed property. 100-year-old estate, sold as is." The county didn't bother hiding its eagerness to unload it. Starting bid, $32,000, practically giving it away. "All right, folks," the auctioneer's voice cut through the wind. "We'll begin now. The property being offered is Waverly Hollow, a 90-acre parcel including residential dwelling, outbuildings, and historical structures. Please remember, property is sold as is, and no contingencies will be accepted. Starting bid is $32,000. Silence. Then, with a breath that felt like a leap off a cliff, Grace raised her paddle. "Bidder 12, 32,000, the auctioneer called. "Do I hear 33? Hale raised his hand. Grace didn't flinch, neither did her paddle. 34, 35, 40, 45. It escalated quickly. Grace had capped herself at 55, the full sum of Dan's life insurance, every last dime she hadn't used on bills or the kids' college funds. Her hand went up for the final time. 55,000, the auctioneer announced. "Do I hear 56? Hale hesitated. The air hung tense as his jaw flexed. Grace's heart thudded in her chest. Going once, going twice. Hale gave a tight, annoyed shake of his head. Sold. To bidder 12. The words hit her like a thunderclap. Sophie squealed. Caleb exhaled sharply. Grace just stood there, stunned. She had done it. She owned Waverly Hollow. Later that afternoon, after signing a stack of papers that felt more like an act of faith than legality, they walked the perimeter of the house. The structure loomed large and tired, paint peeled like old sunburn, window panes warped with age. But it stood. Caleb circled back from the rear porch with a frown. "There's something weird back here," he said. "You should see this." Grace followed him around to the west-facing side of the house. A smaller wing, disconnected from the main hall by a sealed breezeway, stood shuttered and barred. "This part isn't on the floor plan," Caleb said, pulling up the county's digitized survey on his phone. "Look, main house, east wing, barn, root cellar, but nothing about this section. It's like it doesn't exist." Grace frowned. The west wing had been mentioned in passing in one of the old real estate listings, but there were no details, no photos, just the words, "structurally unsound, condemned." And yet it stood, intact. A rusted padlock held the breezeway doors shut. Sophie stepped up beside them, snapping another photo. "Creepy," she murmured. "It's like something's hiding in there." Grace stepped back, suddenly chilled despite her coat. She looked once more at the wing, at the broken dormer window above, and at the faint outline of what looked like scorched timber in the upper trim. And that was when she saw it. A rolled-up blueprint, jammed behind a fallen plank in the porch eaves. She tugged it free, her hands trembling slightly. The parchment was brittle, yellowed with age. Across the top, in elaborate handwriting, "Waverly Hollow, Architectural Plan, 1923. As she unrolled the document, her eyes traced the ink lines, the cross-sections of the house. And then she saw it. A labeled room in the west wing. Observatory, sealed per owner's instructions, 1974. But the newer blueprints from the county didn't show that room at all. Her heart beat faster. She looked up at the wing again. Shuttered windows, rusted lock, hidden for decades. Something wasn't adding up. And deep in her gut, Grace Whitaker knew this was only the beginning. The wind howled through the brittle branches of the bare cottonwoods as dusk settled over Waverly Hollow. Inside the farmhouse, the cold crept in through the gaps in the windows, mingling with the scent of old timber and damp plaster. Grace wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her hands red from scrubbing soot off the dining room hearth. The house hadn't known warmth in decades, and it wasn't giving in easily. "The water heater just coughed at me," Caleb called from the basement, his voice muffled beneath the floorboards. "Swear it sounded like it said its last prayer." Grace sighed, brushing a loose strand of hair from her forehead. "Just get it running long enough for Sophie to take a shower. We'll worry about replacing it when we've got food in the fridge that isn't in cans." Upstairs, Sophie sat cross-legged on the creaky floor of her bedroom, her camera resting on her lap. She had tried taking some pictures earlier that afternoon, sunlight slanting through cracked panes, dust motes dancing in midair. But even her love of decay as aesthetic couldn't mask the overwhelming gloom of the place. The walls were a dull, yellowing white, and the wallpaper in the hallway peeled like ancient birch bark. She was adjusting her lens cap when she heard it again. Click, click, clack. It was faint, barely louder than the soft creaks of the settling house. But it was distinct, and it was close. Sophie sat still, breath held. The sound came again. This time, she could trace it. The wall just outside her bedroom, down the hall, near the dining room. She stood slowly, setting her camera aside. Her footsteps were careful, practiced. She'd learned to move like a shadow over the years, a habit born more from artistic intent than fear. But tonight, something about the sound made her stomach knot. As she passed the upstairs bathroom, a sudden flicker of the hallway light made her flinch. The bulb buzzed, then dimmed to a pale orange glow. Downstairs, she could hear her mother in the kitchen, the clatter of pans muffled but reassuring. Sophie crept down the stairs, her fingers grazing the handrail. The noise was gone now. She stepped into the dining room, eyes drawn to the far wall, a section where the wallpaper seemed newer than the rest, almost too intact. She ran her hand along the surface. The wood beneath gave slightly under her touch, as if something hollow lurked behind it. Click. She jerked her hand back. "Caleb," she called, her voice steadier than she felt. Moments later, her brother emerged from the basement, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that had seen better days. "What's up?" Sophie pointed toward the wall. "There's something behind there, I swear. It keeps clicking, like a loose latch or something shifting." Caleb tilted his head, listening. Nothing. He walked over, pressing an ear to the paneling. "Huh?" He rapped his knuckles against it, then again a few inches to the left. The second knock sounded duller. "Yeah, you might be onto something." Grace appeared in the doorway, drying her hands on a dish towel. "What are you two doing?" "Either we've got very polite mice, or there's a dead space in this wall," Caleb said. Grace frowned. "You mean like a crawl space?" Caleb shrugged. "Maybe, but it sounds like there's something moving in there, or maybe just shifting because of the cold." Grace stepped closer, touching the wall herself. It did feel strange, not quite level, and the pattern of the wallpaper didn't align perfectly with the rest of the room. She hadn't noticed it before. "I don't like the sound of something moving in our walls," she muttered. "We could open it up," Caleb suggested. "With what?" Grace asked. "We barely have a working toaster, let alone carpentry tools." Caleb smirked. "Lucky for you, I came prepared." From the back porch, he retrieved an old crowbar he'd kept in his truck from his campus job with the agricultural maintenance crew. He returned with it, slung over his shoulder like an axe. "Go easy," Grace warned. "If we bust a pipe or bring down the wall, I'm sending you back to live in the barn." With careful pressure, Caleb wedged the crowbar under the edge of the wooden panel. He pried slowly, the nails groaning in protest. Dust and flakes of paint rained down. Sophie held her breath. One more pop, and the board shifted. Behind it was not insulation, not wiring, not moldy drywall. It was wood, darker, older, smoother, a door. "What the hell?" Caleb whispered. The wooden door was narrow, framed by thick beams that looked hand-hewn. A brass handle, tarnished with age, jutted out from one side. What caught their attention most was the heavy lock, an exterior padlock bolted into the wood. Grace stepped closer, heart thudding. "It's locked, from the outside," she said. "Why would someone seal a room off like this?" Caleb ran his fingers along the edge, finding no keyhole on their side. "This doesn't look like part of the house plans." "Because it wasn't," Grace replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I looked through the old blueprints. This wall should be solid." Sophie shivered. "Then what the hell is behind that door?" None of them had an answer, but in the silence that followed, the clicking sound came again. Click, click, clack, this time from the other side. The morning after their discovery, Grace stood in front of the hidden wooden door, arms folded, coffee cooling in her hand. The pale winter sun poured through the narrow hallway windows, casting long, golden stripes across the dusty floorboards. The door stood stubbornly shut, its iron latch rusted but intact. Caleb leaned in close, inspecting the hinges with a flashlight. "Still can't believe this was behind the wall the whole time. It's like the house is hiding something from us." Sophie hovered nearby with her camera, her fingers twitching with anticipation. "Maybe it's a panic room, or some kind of prohibition stash." "Or a murder den," Caleb said with a grin, then immediately winced when Grace shot him a look. "We're not assuming the worst," Grace said, though her voice wavered. She hadn't slept well. Dreams full of creaking floors, muffled whispers, and cold air pressing against her skin. The room behind the door had haunted her thoughts like a phantom. Now it was time to face it. But first, she needed answers. Later that afternoon, Grace drove into town and parked outside the Elm Ridge Public Library, the very building where she worked part-time shelving biographies and digitizing old town records. It was closed today, but she had keys. Inside, the scent of aging paper and lemon polish greeted her like an old friend. She moved swiftly through the quiet stacks toward the archive room in the back, unlocking the heavy door. The archive was a temperature-controlled tomb of local memory, yellowing land surveys, brittle blueprints, tax records typed on onion skin paper. She set her satchel down and rolled up her sleeves. If there was something odd about Waverly Hollow, especially the West Wing, It would be buried here. She started with the oldest map she could find, a township survey from 1902. The land was labeled under Renshaw Holdings, the original family name on the deed. Nothing strange there. Then a 1940 update, a clear outline of the main house, barn, and surrounding acreage, but no mention of any internal sealed rooms. Another map from 1963 caught her eye. This one had precise measurements of the home's interior structure. She traced a finger down the west side, and there it was, a faint, penciled square between the dining room and western corridor. Not labeled, no notes, no door. Just a shape. Bingo, she whispered. She spent the next hour digging through zoning documents and building permits. Something changed in 1965. A permit to reinforce foundation wall, west section, had been filed but then canceled, handwritten in red ink. Interior section closed. Do not disturb. No contractor name. No follow-up inspection. Odd. Even odder, the file folder was half empty. No blueprints, no structural reports. Grace left the library with a thumb drive of scanned documents and a head full of questions. Whatever was behind that door, someone had gone to considerable lengths to keep it forgotten. That evening, Grace returned to the house and found Caleb in the hallway with a crowbar and a look that said he hadn't waited for permission. "I got the hinges loosened," he said, tapping the metal. "Want to do the honors?" Sophie stood behind him, camera already rolling. Grace hesitated, then stepped forward. The latch resisted, groaning like something half asleep and unhappy to be woken. Then, with a sudden snap, it gave way. The door creaked inward on rusty hinges, and they stared. The room was small, maybe 10 feet by 12, lit only by a narrow, grime-covered window on the far wall. Dust clung to everything like fog, coating the floor, the single table, the file cabinets, the peeling walls. "Whoa," Sophie breathed. It looked as if time had stopped sometime in the mid-1960s, and no one had dared to enter since. A cracked leather chair sat in the corner next to a rusting floor lamp. A rotary phone, disconnected, rested on a desk layered in yellowed papers. Caleb stepped in cautiously, shining his flashlight around. "It smells like an attic and mothballs had a baby." Grace moved to the table and lifted a faded manila envelope labeled Land Acquisition, Parcel 7B. Inside were old survey maps, topographic ones with thick red circles and notes written in firm, blocky script. One circled area had the word unstable, underlined 3 times. Another folder held soil reports and typed correspondence between someone named H.T. Langston and a company called Sequoia Resource Group, dated 1964. The company name didn't ring any bells. Sophie picked up a small black canister and held it up to the light. "It's a film roll, like from an old 8mm camera, not developed." "Don't open it," Grace said automatically, instinctively protective. "The film might still be salvageable. We'll need a darkroom or a lab to look at it properly." They moved slowly through the space, cataloging items with the same reverence archaeologists might afford a dig site. On one wall was a large, brittle map of Elmridge County, with tiny pins pressed into specific rural areas. Some pins had paper tags with strange numbers and single-letter notations, B-4, G-2, S-1. In the corner, Caleb crouched and tapped the floorboards. "Mom," he said after a moment, "there's something under here." She knelt beside him. One section of the floor felt hollow beneath their fingers. Caleb wedged the crowbar under the edge and pried. With a groan, a loose plank lifted away, revealing a shallow cavity. And in that cavity sat a rusted metal box, the size of a carry-on suitcase. A safe. The dial was stiff, the numbers faded, but the lock hadn't been broken or forced. It was still sealed tight. "Well, that's not suspicious at all," Caleb muttered. Grace looked at the box, then around the room. There were too many questions, too many secrets layered in dust. "We don't open it yet," she said, though the temptation clawed at her. "Not until we understand more." Sophie snapped a photo, the flash lighting up the entire room. The shutter click echoed off the plaster walls, sharp and final, like a line had been crossed. They stood in silence for a moment, the stale air pressing in around them. Somewhere beyond the window, a winter wind picked up, whistling through cracks in the walls. But down in that hidden room, time stood still, like it had been waiting for them to come back. The sound of grinding metal echoed through the room as Caleb slowly turned the old, rusted dial of the safe. Grace knelt beside him, holding a flashlight while Sophie stood at the doorway, tension evident in the way she clutched her camera. The dust in the hidden room seemed thicker, as if the years of silence were being disturbed in protest. A dull clunk vibrated through the floor when the final combination clicked. Caleb hesitated. "You ready?" he asked, sweat beading on his brow despite the chill in the air. "Open it," Grace said softly. The safe door creaked open with a reluctant groan, revealing a small, shallow interior lined with faded velvet. Inside sat a manila envelope, thick and fraying at the edges, along with a brown, leather-bound notebook, its cover warped by time. Atop both items rested a red stamped file folder labeled in bold black lettering, Vermilion, Top Secret, Property of U.S. Government. Grace reached in carefully and lifted the documents, brushing dust from the top. She had seen classified markings before while archiving declassified documents at the library, but this was something different. The weight of history and danger seeped through the pages. She opened the folder and scanned the top page, her breath catching. "What is it?" Caleb asked. Grace read aloud. "Project Vermilion, an experimental program in botanical engineering and agricultural surveillance initiated June 12, 1961. Funding and oversight provided by the Department of Defense." Sophie looked up sharply. "Agricultural surveillance?" Grace nodded slowly, eyes scanning the fine print. "It mentions Fort Dutton and several remote test sites, including one in Elmridge County." "Wait," Caleb said, stepping closer. "Here." Before anyone could speak, the front doorbell rang. They looked at each other, startled. "No one even knows we're living here yet," Sophie whispered. Grace rose, heart pounding, and made her way cautiously to the front door. She opened it to find Councilman Roger Hale, standing under the eaves, wearing a long wool coat and an expression that walked the line between polite and predatory. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said with a smile too polished to be sincere. "May I come in?" Grace blinked. "It's not really a good time, Councilman. We're still settling in." "I won't take long," he said smoothly. "Just wanted to follow up on the auction. Quite the surprise that Waverly Hollow went to a private citizen. The town was considering purchasing it for redevelopment." Grace tightened her grip on the door. "It was an open auction." He nodded slowly. "Indeed. Well, if you find the upkeep is more than you bargained for, I'm authorized to make a generous offer. On behalf of a buyer who wishes to remain anonymous, of course." Sophie had crept behind her mother and now peered over her shoulder. "We're not selling," she said bluntly. Hale raised a brow. "Of course not. Still, it's an old property. Sometimes they come with complications." Grace felt it then, something in his tone, a subtle, calculated warning. "I appreciate your concern," she said, keeping her voice steady. "But we're doing just fine." He gave her one last, tight-lipped smile. "Well, I do hope it stays that way." Then, with a nod, he turned and walked down the gravel path to his waiting sedan. As the taillights disappeared into the dusk, Grace closed the door and leaned against it, her mind racing. "Did he seem off to you?" Sophie asked. "Very." Back in the hidden room, Grace spread the documents across the floor. They were a mix of military briefings, field notes, maps, and memos, all pointing to something called bioadaptive substrates and harvest monitoring protocols. A few pages had thick black redactions, with only phrases like civilian exposure and long-term soil volatility remaining. Caleb flipped through the leather notebook. "This looks like someone's personal journal, probably whoever was stationed here." Grace looked at the handwriting. It was neat, clinical. The entries described soil experiments, genetic modifications in wheat, and unexpected interactions with groundwater contaminants. One entry was circled, March 3, 1964. "Primary anomaly persists. Root systems display adaptive behavior beyond anticipated parameters. Request for shutdown denied. Advised to continue monitoring." Sophie frowned. "This doesn't sound like a normal farm." "It wasn't," Grace said quietly. This place was a testing ground. Caleb pointed to a map in the folder, the edges brittle but legible. This plot is Waverly Hollow. It's marked as Site 4. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what they'd found sinking in. I think it's time to bring in Sheriff Branson, Grace said. Sheriff Tyler Branson arrived less than 30 minutes after Grace called him. He wore his usual stoic expression, but his eyes were alert as she led him through the farmhouse and into the hidden room. She handed him the vermilion folder without a word. He read the first few pages in silence, then looked up sharply. Where did you find this? In a hidden safe under the floorboards, behind the sealed room Caleb uncovered. Branson's jaw tightened. This isn't some dusty local dispute. This is federal. He reached for his radio but hesitated. I'll make a secure call. We need to keep this quiet for now. You said Councilman Hale stopped by? Grace nodded. He offered to buy the farm, claimed the town had plans. Branson's face darkened. Hale's been pushing aggressive redevelopment for years. He's connected to a company that's been buying up historical parcels. If this land was used in a covert government program, and he knew... He didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he stepped out of the room and began placing a call on a secure line. Sophie drifted toward the bookshelf that lined one side of the room. She trailed her fingers along the dusty spines until one caught her attention. It was an old legal volume, worn, leather-bound, and oddly out of place among the military records and scientific data. She pulled it gently from the shelf. Something clinked against the floor. A small brass key had fallen from between the pages and landed at her feet. "Mom," she said, holding it up. "Look what I just found." Grace turned and took the key, examining it. There were no markings, just a tiny, intricate bow and an antique design that suggested it belonged to an older lock, maybe a chest or drawer. Branson returned a moment later. "Who found the key?" he asked. "Sophie did." He nodded grimly. "If the rest of this is what I think it is, that key may open more than just a box. It may open a door we can't close again." No one spoke for a long moment. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the branches of the trees and sending a shiver through the old bones of Waverly Hollow. The morning sun did little to warm the frost-laced glass of the Waverly Hollow windows. Grace stood in the hallway outside the sealed west wing, a steaming mug of coffee in her hands and a growing sense of unease curling in her gut. The house had felt different ever since they'd cracked open that sealed room and unearthed the government files. Something had shifted, not just in the creaking of floorboards or the hum of old wires, but in the air itself, as if the house had exhaled after holding its breath for decades. Caleb appeared beside her, holding a small crowbar and a flashlight. "Sheriff Branson said we could keep exploring, so long as we don't disturb anything else without logging it first," he said. "You sure about this?" Grace nodded. "It's time we saw what's behind that door." They had already cleared the hallway of old furniture, and Caleb worked the crowbar into the warped wood of the barricade, sealing off the west wing. The nails groaned and squealed as they came loose. Sophie stood a few feet away with her camera ready, documenting every moment for the record. When the final board clattered to the floor, the door swung open with a dry creak, releasing a gust of air that smelled of dust, metal, and time. Beyond the threshold, the hallway stretched in eerie silence. The wallpaper was stained and peeling, and the floor was coated with a thick layer of grime. They stepped inside cautiously, the beam from Caleb's flashlight bouncing off tarnished fixtures and long-forgotten furnishings. "This place hasn't seen light in decades," Sophie whispered. At the end of the corridor, they found a door slightly ajar. Caleb pushed it open to reveal a room that didn't match the rest of the Victorian farmhouse. It was cold, clinical. Metal filing cabinets lined the walls. There were lab tables, glass containers, and old radiation warning signs faded to near invisibility. "What is this?" Caleb murmured. Grace stepped forward, brushing her fingers over a cracked chalkboard covered in faded writing. Though difficult to decipher, one phrase was still legible. Project F, Stage 3 results. Sophie moved toward a dusty shelving unit. "Guys," she said slowly, "you need to see this." She lifted one of several thick glass jars, each sealed tightly and labeled with numerical codes. Inside was soil, but not ordinary soil. Some samples were dark as pitch, others a strange reddish hue, and one even shimmered faintly with what looked like metallic flakes. Grace found a weathered binder lying beside a lab microscope. Inside were detailed entries tracking soil experiments, crop yields, mutation rates. The handwriting changed several times across the pages, suggesting multiple contributors over the years. They were testing something, Grace muttered, and not just any farming technique. These are controlled experiments involving mineral absorption, synthetic fertilizers, maybe even radiation. Caleb had moved to a storage cabinet in the corner. He pulled open a drawer and retrieved a thin leather notebook. "Looks like field notes," he said. "Mentions exposure trials, something about sun cycles and growth acceleration." Sophie, meanwhile, was inspecting a portion of the wall where the paint was newer, uneven. Her fingers brushed the surface lightly. "Wait," she said, her voice taut. "There's something behind this." She tapped against the paneling, which responded with a hollow thud. Caleb joined her with the crowbar and gently pried away a loose segment of the wall. Behind it, nestled between two studs, was a dusty metal object the size of a shoebox. They carefully pulled it out and set it on the central work table. It was a tape recorder, an old-school reel-to-reel machine, surprisingly well-preserved. "There's a tape already loaded," Sophie said. "Do we play it?" Grace hesitated only a second. "Yes." Caleb rewound the tape slightly and pressed the play button. The machine whirred, and then the room filled with a man's voice, shaky but determined. "If anyone finds this," the voice began, "you need to understand what we did here. Project F was never about sustainable farming. Not really. It was about control, about weaponizing the land itself." A pause, then a long sigh. "They said the plants could absorb toxins, but something else started absorbing too, and it watched us. We tried to contain it. God help us, we tried." The tape crackled, then cut off abruptly. The silence that followed was absolute. Sophie looked at Grace with wide, stunned eyes. "What does he mean? Something else started absorbing?" Grace stared at the tape recorder, her fingers slowly curling into fists. "I don't know," she said, "but I think it's time we find out." They stood in the middle of the forgotten lab, surrounded by cryptic samples and the ghostly echo of a warning that had gone unheard for decades. The answers were here, buried in this wing, sealed away for reasons no one had wanted to face. And whatever it was, it might not have been entirely left behind. The wind had shifted again. It always did, Grace noticed, just before something unsettling happened on the property. That morning, as she stood barefoot on the creaky front porch of Waverly Hollow, mug of lukewarm coffee in hand, a strange unease pricked at her skin despite the warming sun. The air was too still, not silent, but watching. She wasn't the only one who noticed. "Mom," Caleb called from the side of the house, his voice low but tight with concern. "Come look at this." Grace walked across the warped porch planks and around the house, where her son knelt by the window outside the dining room. The ground beneath him was soft with early morning dew, and there, clearly marked in the moist earth, were a set of boot prints, not hers, not Caleb's, and they hadn't been there the night before. "That's the third time this week," he muttered, brushing his hand along the frame where dirt smudged the glass. "Same pattern, same place, always by this window." Grace's pulse quickened. "We need to set up the trail camera tonight." Caleb gave a short nod. "Already done. I moved the one from the barn. Should have caught something if it came back last night." But when they checked the footage hours later, the camera revealed nothing. Static, a long stretch of blackness, no movement, no shapes, no intruders. Just silence, just omission. By afternoon, Grace needed air, or more accurately, distance. The unsettling feeling hadn't left her since Sophie had discovered that old recorder in the lab. They had played the message back several times, and even now, its echo haunted the house. "He doesn't sleep. He waits. Don't look through the glass when he passes by. He sees more than the rest of us ever did." Grace couldn't shake the idea that someone, or something, had never left Waverly Hollow. She made her way into town and parked her beat-up Subaru outside the Elm Ridge Public Library. Her former workplace felt like a distant memory now, a relic from a simpler life. A time before rusted safes, sealed-off rooms, and chilling whispers on decades-old tape. Inside, the smell of old paper and lemon-scented cleaner grounded her. She approached the research desk, manned today by a familiar face. "Maggie," Grace said, offering a tight smile. The older librarian looked up and blinked in surprise. "Well, well, look who's back from the dead," then softening. "It's good to see you, Grace." "You holding up okay out there?" Grace exhaled. "Depends on what you mean by okay." She explained in low tones that she was looking into the Renshaw family, specifically any public records, arrest reports, or mentions in archived news between the 1950s and 1970s. Maggie's brows furrowed. "Now there's a name I haven't heard in a while. Hang tight. I'll pull what we've got." An hour later, Grace sat cross-legged at one of the back tables, poring over brittle clippings and faded microfiche scans. What she found made her stomach twist. In 1962, a brief mention in the Elm Ridge Tribune. Local man Clarence Renshaw questioned in suspected illegal testing of soil chemicals. In 1965, federal agents investigate Renshaw estate for possible violation of agriculture safety ordinances, no charges filed. And then in 1971, the most damning, unofficial sources allege Waverly Hollow estate may have been involved in Cold War-era black operations tied to experimental food resiliency trials. Congress inquiry closed due to lack of evidence and destroyed records. Beside the article was a blurred black and white photograph of Clarence Renshaw standing on the porch of the house Grace now lived in. His eyes, even through grainy print, looked wild, cornered. She swallowed hard. Whatever had happened out at Waverly Hollow hadn't just been agricultural testing. It had been political and dangerous. That night, the wind howled again. Sophie tossed in her bed, unease fluttering under her skin like moth wings. She sat upright when she heard it, a soft scuffling outside the window, like fingertips dragging along the pane. She crept to the glass, but found only darkness, the kind that swallows porch lights and makes shadows feel personal. The next morning, Caleb was pale as he stood by the barn door. "Someone broke the lock," he said. "They went inside." Grace rushed to inspect the damage. The padlock, new as of last week, had been snapped clean at the curve. Inside, boxes were disturbed, a tarp pulled back, and on the workbench sat a single sheet of yellowed paper with blocky black letters written across the center. "Don't dig any deeper." No signature, no explanation, just a warning. Later that afternoon, Sheriff Branson pulled into their driveway unannounced. "I got your message," he said, stepping out of his cruiser with his usual air of cautious professionalism. "But it's not just your voicemail that concerned me. I got a report from the county clerk this morning. Councilman Hale requested land use permits for a soil reclamation operation at Waverly Hollow, filed under an alias corporation." Grace's mouth fell open. "He's trying to take the land out from under us? Or at least claim parts of it that aren't being utilized properly," the sheriff confirmed grimly. Grace handed him the anonymous note. Branson read it twice, his jaw tightening. "Who else knows about the documents you found in that room?" he asked quietly. "Just the kids, and you," he nodded. "Keep it that way for now." That night, Grace didn't sleep. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table with a printout of the Renshaw family tree, local zoning maps, and a flickering candle. Outside, the wind kept brushing the side of the house like fingers testing for weakness. And every so often, she thought she heard something move on the porch. A creak, a shift of weight, a breath held just too long. Somewhere out in the dark, she knew the watcher was still waiting. And this time, he had left a message. The knock on the farmhouse door came just as the sun began to dip behind the hills of Elm Ridge, casting long shadows across the lavender fields, now cloaked in early autumn gold. Grace had been expecting someone, though she didn't know exactly who. The letter had arrived the day before. No return address, just a crisp ivory envelope with her name written in ink that looked like it had been penned with a fountain pen. Inside, a single line: "I can help. Meet me at the farmhouse." DC. She opened the door to find a man in his early 70s standing on the porch, tall and sharply dressed, despite the worn leather coat and battered briefcase he held at his side. His silver hair was slicked back neatly, and his deep-set eyes scanned her face with unsettling precision. "Mrs. Whitaker?" His voice was gravelly but composed. "Yes, and you are?" "Darius Cole," he said simply. "I used to work for them, for Vermilion." Grace stepped aside and let him in without a word. Something about him, his calm intensity, the deliberate way he moved, told her he wasn't here for pleasantries. They sat at the kitchen table. Caleb and Sophie joined shortly after, both wary, especially after the events of the past few days. Sophie kept glancing toward the window, still shaken by the note left in the barn. Caleb's jaw was clenched, arms folded, ready to pounce at the first sign of trouble. "I read about your discovery in the Renshaw files," Darius began. "The Project F notes, the tape recorder, the sealed well." "You were part of that?" Caleb asked, suspicion lining his voice. "I was part of the oversight team, Department of Energy initially, then transferred under a different umbrella. Let's just say the left hand didn't always know what the right was doing." Grace leaned forward. "Why come forward now?" "Because I've seen how these things end when truth stays buried," Darius said, "and because someone out there is trying very hard to keep you from finding the rest of it." He reached into his briefcase and removed a metal box about the size of a shoebox, setting it on the table with a soft clunk. When he opened it, Grace saw what looked like an old military-issue Geiger counter, except this one had been modified, its dials marked with symbols she didn't recognize. "This is a modified radiation detection unit," Darius explained. "Not the kind used for general background readings. This one detects specific isotopes, ones we used in the Vermilion trials. You see, Project F wasn't just about growing plants in contaminated soil. It was about creating plant strains that could absorb and isolate heavy metals, lead, cadmium, even uranium, from industrial waste. Clean the soil from the inside out." Grace blinked. "Phytoremediation." "Yes, but we weren't just trying to restore land. We were trying to weaponize the process, create crops that could be used to identify or even sabotage enemy sites. Plants that would absorb and then reveal hidden waste storage or contaminate enemy soil over time. What we didn't expect," he paused, his voice dropping, "was that the plants would start reacting to things they shouldn't have." "Such as?" Sophie asked. "There were reports," Darius continued, "of neurological side effects on livestock that grazed too close to certain test zones. One technician claimed to see movement in plants that should have been dormant, almost as if they were responding to human presence." Caleb scoffed. "You're telling us you created radioactive killer plants?" But I'm saying we created something unnatural, and nature doesn't forgive easily." A heavy silence fell over the room. Darius turned on the device and set it on the table. Its dial hummed softly as the needle hovered near the baseline. "This place is clean, for now, but I need to show you something else." They followed him down into the basement, where old canning jars and rusted tools lined the shelves. Darius moved straight to the back wall, where a narrow corridor had been revealed behind a sliding panel Grace hadn't even known existed until last week. He led them through the passage into the old storm shelter Caleb had cleaned out, the one they'd started using for storage. Now, Darius turned the device on again. At first, the needle barely twitched. Then, as he moved toward a far corner, it spiked. Grace stepped back instinctively. "What's under there?" Darius pointed to the concrete slab near the floor drain. "That used to be an access shaft to a well. The Renshaws sealed it with cement back in the 70s, after things went wrong." He removed a folded blueprint from his case, an original copy of the Waverly Hollow site plan, with annotations scribbled in red ink. He pointed to a circle marked S-2 next to the cellar. This was the auxiliary containment site. When one of the early crop generations started behaving unpredictably, they dumped the biomass down the shaft and sealed it. What they didn't realize, he added grimly, was that some of the isotopes used in that experiment had half-lives exceeding 50 years. "Why would they leave it here?" Grace asked. "Why not extract it?" "They tried, but there were incidents. Men getting sick, some just walking off the job without explanation. The program was shut down overnight, and records were buried so deep even Congress never heard about it." Sophie spoke quietly. "So, what now?" Darius looked at her, then at Grace. Now you have a decision to make. You can ignore this and go on pretending you bought an old farm with a few broken windows and busted plumbing. Or you can dig deeper. But if you do, understand this. You're not the only ones watching this place anymore. He reached into his coat and handed Grace a second envelope. "What's this?" she asked. "Coordinates. Places on the property where we conducted secondary tests. One of them might hold answers the well won't give you." He turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and one more thing. If you see Councilman Hale again, don't let him in. The last time I saw him near a federal project site, 2 whistleblowers went missing. Just watch your backs." As the door shut behind him, the silence in the kitchen felt denser than before. Later that night, after Grace tucked Sophie into bed and Caleb returned from checking the perimeter, she opened the envelope. The coordinates pointed to 3 locations, one near the eastern fence line, one beneath the collapsed greenhouse, and one in the barn loft. She looked out the window toward the barn, its weathered silhouette visible beneath the moonlight. Somewhere deep beneath this land, something was stirring again, and this time it wasn't staying buried. The air was heavy with anticipation that morning, saturated with the scent of damp earth and the distant, lingering echo of rainfall from the night before. Grace stood at the edge of the cement-capped well near the northern edge of the Waverly Hollow property, her hands tucked into her jacket pockets, her breath visible in the cold. Behind her, Caleb, Sophie, Sheriff Branson, and Mr. Darius Cole gathered, all silent, all staring at the same spot. The concrete that sealed the well was cracked in places and covered in moss, weathered by decades of abandonment. Darius adjusted the portable radiation scanner he had brought the previous day, the green display screen flickering faintly as it emitted a steady clicking sound. "It's stronger this morning," he murmured, "much stronger. Whatever's beneath this, it's not dormant." Branson gave the go-ahead with a solemn nod. Within the hour, a small excavation crew, contracted under the sheriff's orders, arrived and began carefully breaking away the old cement seal. Caleb and Grace watched every movement, tension coiled tight between them. By early afternoon, the concrete cap had been removed, revealing a rusted steel cover beneath, one that had clearly been added after the original construction. Bolted down and reinforced, the lid had a single circular handle in the center. Branson stepped forward, placing his gloved hands on the ring and heaving upward. It didn't budge. "Try it together," Grace offered. With Darius and Caleb's help, the cover finally lifted with a metallic groan, revealing a narrow descending shaft. A ladder bolted to the interior wall vanished into the darkness. "We'll lower a light first," Branson instructed, motioning to the crew. A camera with a mounted floodlight was carefully dropped on a cable into the shaft. The screen flickered, then came to life. The feed revealed a chamber about 20 feet down, a room, not just an empty cavity. The walls were lined with corrugated steel, the floor concrete, and in the center, a body. Clad in what appeared to be a tattered olive-drab military uniform, slumped against the far wall. The figure was partially decomposed, clearly long dead, but not ancient. Gasps erupted around the monitor. "Dear God," Grace whispered. Branson spoke into his radio. "We'll need forensics down here. Full team. This is a crime scene now." While the sheriff's deputies cordoned off the area, Grace couldn't take her eyes off the screen. The camera panned left, revealing several large metal crates stacked against the wall. Each was marked with stenciled letters, "Property of U.S. Government." One was open, its contents visible. Wires, vacuum tubes, metallic panels from old equipment that looked straight out of a 1960s lab. Darius stepped closer to the screen, adjusting his glasses. "Those are Cold War prototypes, maybe signal jamming or early radiation shielding tech. I saw similar equipment during my years with the agency." Branson's face tightened. "We're not dealing with local history anymore. This just became federal." 2 hours later, the FBI's regional field office dispatched a team to Waverly Hollow. Grace watched as 3 unmarked black SUVs arrived, carrying men and women in windbreakers emblazoned with bold yellow letters. She met them at the edge of the property, the unofficial keeper of the secrets buried beneath. Special Agent Lisa Guerrero led the team, brisk and no-nonsense. She reviewed the footage, examined Darius's radiation readings, and made a swift decision. This entire area is now a restricted federal site. We will need your cooperation." Grace nodded, though her stomach turned with the shift. Waverly Hollow was no longer just hers. It now belonged to the past and to the government it once served. That evening, the FBI team descended into the well. By floodlight, they retrieved the remains with methodical care, placing them in a sealed container. The crates were next, 3 in total, hoisted up by winch, each heavier than the last. Agent Guerrero approached Grace afterward. "The uniform matches those used by Army intelligence units stationed in Montana during the late 60s. We won't know identity until dental and DNA come back, but he wasn't listed as ever stationed here." "So he was off record," Caleb said flatly. Guerrero gave a tight nod. As night fell, the team began cataloging the contents of the crates. Old files, many marked classified or vermilion, were packed alongside arcane-looking equipment. One folder caught Grace's eye as it was lifted carefully from its container. In bold, typewritten font, "Operation Vermilion, Site W13. "That's us," Darius muttered. "Site W13. I remember the designation." Grace leaned in. "What was it?" "Really?" Darius hesitated. "It was supposed to be a study on accelerated phytoremediation, using plants to extract toxins from soil, but the science quickly moved toward military applications. They realized plants could be engineered to concentrate certain metals, gold, uranium, even rare earth elements." "Weaponized agriculture?" Sophie asked, incredulous. "Essentially," he said, "but something went wrong." That night, back in the farmhouse, Grace sat with the family and Darius in the dining room. Sophie had started sorting through photographs of the well chamber that she had taken discreetly. One in particular caught Grace's eye, a blurred document, just legible in the corner of a crate. She zoomed in. "What is that?" Caleb asked. Grace read aloud, heart hammering. "Second survivor unaccounted for, presumed compromised. Active status, unknown." The room fell into stunned silence. Darius broke it. "There were two survivors of whatever happened here?" Sophie asked. "Yes," he confirmed slowly. "One of them's in that chamber. The other could still be out there." The wind rattled the shutters outside, and for a brief moment, none of them spoke. The past had clawed its way into the present, and now, whatever had been buried under concrete and silence was far from over. Grace looked toward the darkened west wing and whispered almost to herself, "We've only just scratched the surface." A bitter wind swept across Waverly Hollow as a gray sky brooded over the distant mountains. The kind of morning where silence felt heavy, like the land itself was holding its breath. Grace Whitaker stood on the porch, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the dirt road that wound toward Elmridge. Something had shifted since they'd cracked open the secrets of the old well. The air didn't just feel colder, it felt watched. Inside the farmhouse, Caleb sat hunched over a stack of copied documents from the sealed bunker beneath the well. Sophie, headphones on, replayed the strange voice from the audio recorder over and over again, scribbling notes in her journal. Grace had taken to checking the locks every few hours, unsure what frightened her more, the past they'd uncovered or the eyes she now felt on her family. Then came the call. Sheriff Branson's voice crackled through the phone, low and urgent. "Grace, Darius Cole's been found, dead, near Miller's Creek." She didn't speak for a full beat. Then, how? Blunt force trauma. There was a message scrawled in mud beside him. "Silence is safety." Grace's grip on the receiver tightened. Did he have anything on him? Just his ID, but there was a small tape recorder. Might have been meant for you. He brought it over that evening, placing it on their kitchen table like it was made of glass. Caleb and Sophie hovered close, and Grace pressed play. Darius's voice poured out, ragged, tired, but clear. "If you're hearing this, I'm gone. They were faster than I thought, but I won't let Hale get away with it." A pause. The tape hissed softly. Roger Hale, Councilman Hale. He wasn't just connected to Vermilion. He orchestrated the cover-up. He and a handful of others ensured the failed trials were buried, along with the bodies, The farmhouse, the well, the bunker, all sterilized, but not erased. Another breath. There was a second survivor of the 1969 trials. Hale made sure he disappeared. I think he's still here, still watching. And there's one more place, off-grid, a structure west of Black Pine Grove, not on any current maps. Find it. The tape clicked off. Sophie stared at the recorder, jaw clenched. We need to get that story out, all of it. Grace nodded and immediately compiled the evidence. The documents, the recordings, scanned pages from the Vermilion files, and sent them to a journalist she once knew in Missoula, now working at a national syndicate. She also forwarded the materials to 2 local investigative blogs. The next morning, a white envelope appeared in their mailbox. No stamp, no return address. Inside was a single note, typed, no signature. Stop now. You've been warned. The next mistake will cost you your family. The chill that shot through Grace wasn't from the wind. Later that day, Sheriff Branson received a call from a field agent in Billings. The FBI had officially reopened the Vermilion case. Branson wasted no time. That night, under the veil of darkness, he made his move. At a town council meeting, Councilman Hale barely had time to finish a speech about infrastructure funding when Branson approached, badge out. Roger Hale, you're under arrest for obstruction of justice and conspiracy in relation to Project Vermilion. Hale's mask cracked for a split second. Surprise, then a quiet, simmering anger. You have no idea what you're dealing with. We'll let the evidence speak for itself, Branson replied. He was escorted out in cuffs. The town buzzed with speculation by morning. Back at the farmhouse, Sophie sat cross-legged in the attic, surrounded by blueprints and faded maps. She had pored over the Renshaw files for days, and one anomaly kept catching her eye. An erased path on a forestry survey from 1973. The map had been digitally altered, but faint outlines still showed a cabin tucked into a thicket west of town. Mom, Sophie called, her voice echoing down the stairs. I think I found it. Grace and Caleb climbed up, hearts pounding. Sophie pointed at the faded ink. This cabin was scrubbed off every map after 1974, but it's referenced here in the Vermilion notes. Darius said it's where they kept the original test results, and maybe something else. Caleb studied the grid marks. This would have been outside county jurisdiction at the time, no oversight, perfect place to hide something big. Grace nodded slowly. Then that's where we go next. She looked out the attic window, toward the distant pines, her heart heavy, but her resolve firm. The past wasn't buried. Not yet. And neither was the truth. The early morning light broke gently over Waverly Hollow, casting long amber streaks across the dewy fields and the cracked stone paths that once led to forgotten barns and silenced doors. It had been weeks since the FBI concluded their investigation. Now, the silence that had once been heavy with mystery had shifted into something more sacred, reverent, like a chapel after the hymn fades. On the front porch of the farmhouse, Grace sat wrapped in her husband's old flannel coat. It still smelled faintly of cedar and tobacco, a quiet echo of everything she'd lost and everything she'd reclaimed. Her hands cupped a chipped blue mug, steam curling from the top as if trying to whisper one last secret from the past. The air was crisp, almost too clean, as though the land itself had exhaled after decades of holding its breath. Inside the living room, Caleb scrolled through articles on his laptop. Headlines blared the news. FBI confirms secret Cold War agricultural experiment, Vermilion files declassified after 50 years, and Montana widow uncovers national scandal beneath her farm. The words didn't feel real. He glanced at Sophie, who sat nearby poring over a leather-bound journal filled with old soil data and plant mutation diagrams. Her camera hung by her side, forgotten for once. The official press conference had been held 2 days prior. With camera crews lined up in front of the Elm Ridge County Courthouse, the lead FBI investigator confirmed the existence of Project Vermilion, detailing its intent to genetically engineer plant life capable of filtering heavy metals from soil, a biological weapon cloaked in agricultural advancement. But something went wrong, mutations that couldn't be explained, a secondary subject who went rogue, and a cover-up that buried it all under concrete, silence, and time. Grace stood in the center of the crowd that day, clutching her children's hands. She didn't want fame. She didn't want speeches. But the Bureau had offered her something else, custodianship. Waverly Hollow was to be preserved as a historical site, not a museum of horror, but a place where truth, however painful, would no longer be hidden, and they wanted Grace to lead it. "I never thought I'd be the keeper of a national secret," she had whispered to Sheriff Branson afterward. He nodded, resting a warm hand on her shoulder. "You're the only one who didn't flinch when the truth stared back." That evening, back on the farm, the three of them walked together across the yard. The land, though scarred, felt like it was slowly coming alive again. Caleb had drafted plans for regenerative crops. Sophie had spoken with documentarians about creating a visual archive of the project. And Grace, though weary, had started envisioning what the next 50 years might look like if the land was healed. Honestly, this time. They began renovations on the old barn first. It was symbolic, a place where the past had tried to hide, now being rebuilt with their hands and grit. As they pulled away rotten boards and replaced rusted hinges, Caleb found something behind the northern wall. "Mom," he called, "you better come see this." Tucked within a loose panel was a weathered leather pouch. Inside, a journal. Small, dusty, the leather cracked. Sophie opened it carefully. On the first page, scrawled in uneven penmanship, were the words, "The next generation must know the truth. Do not let this happen again." They stood silent. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She stood by the window, looking out at the horizon. The stars above Waverly Hollow glimmered clearer than she'd ever seen. Perhaps it was the storm finally passing. Perhaps it was something else. Her fingers brushed the edge of the journal. "This isn't just about the past," she murmured. "It's a promise to the future." And in that stillness, beneath a sky no longer burdened by secrets, Grace Whitaker decided that her story would not end with the uncovering of Project Vermilion. It would live on in the soil, in the seedlings Caleb planted, in the photographs Sophie would share with the world, and in every truth that refused to be buried again. As the morning sun returned to bathe Waverly Hollow in gold, the old farmhouse didn't look abandoned anymore. It looked brave. It looked eternal. And for the first time in a long time, Grace whispered to the wind, "We're home." And that is the story of Grace Whitaker, a woman who lost everything and chose not to break, but to rebuild. A mother who followed a whisper in the wind, all the way to an abandoned farmhouse, and uncovered not just a hidden room, not just forgotten files or failed government projects, but the truth. A truth buried beneath decades of silence, locked behind rusted doors and whispered threats. But perhaps more than that, she uncovered something else. She uncovered that resilience doesn't come from being unbroken. It comes from breaking and still choosing to rise, from fear and standing anyway, from being warned, being watched, and still pushing forward because the people you love, the land you believe in, and the truth you carry in your bones are worth more than comfort or safety or silence. Grace didn't have a master plan. She didn't have power or connections. What she had was instinct and integrity, and the echo of her late husband's voice reminding her to dig deeper. And when she did, she didn't just uncover a conspiracy. She uncovered the pieces of herself she thought had been buried with him. She gave her children something more valuable than inheritance. She gave them legacy. And now, here we are, watching from our screens, listening from afar, wondering if a place like Waverly Hollow could ever be real, if a woman like Grace could truly exist. And maybe, just maybe, wondering if we could be that brave too. If you made it this far in the story, I want you to take a moment, not just to reflect, but to act. Because here's the truth. We don't tell these stories just for shock, or mystery, or nostalgia. We tell them because somewhere out there, someone watching this is standing on the porch of their own broken-down farmhouse, staring at the wind, wondering if they should walk away or walk in. So, let me ask you something. Have you ever felt like you were being underestimated? Have you ever looked around and thought, someone has to stand up, but maybe it shouldn't be me? Have you ever believed something was wrong, but didn't have the power or the platform to speak it out loud? Then maybe, just maybe, Grace's story is yours too. And if it resonated with you, If it lit even a tiny spark, then I invite you to do two things. First, leave us a comment below. Let us know what moment in this story struck you. Was it the sealed room, the journal in the wall, the silence being broken after 50 years? Or was it something quieter, like the way Grace sat on the porch and whispered, "We're home"? Your voice matters here. Your story might be the one that inspires the next viewer to keep watching, keep listening, keep standing. Second, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this isn't the last story we'll tell, not even close. In the weeks to come, we're taking you deeper into forgotten counties, faded farmhouses, and the lives of everyday Americans who uncovered extraordinary truths. We'll meet the teenager who fixed a stranger's tractor and found a helicopter on his front lawn, the widow who inherited a collapsed barn and discovered a secret that rewrote a town's history, and even a high school janitor who found a letter buried beneath a classroom floorboard and changed a legacy that had been broken for generations. These aren't fairy tales. They're stories of grit, of small-town shadows, of people like you and me, who were told to be quiet, to keep their heads down, and instead decided to stand up. So, if you're ready for more, if you're the kind of person who stays to the end, who digs deeper, who believes that truth matters even when it's inconvenient, then this is your channel. And you're part of it now. Join us as we journey to the edge of forgotten fields and haunted barns, quiet hallways and shuttered homes, because the truth is, America's not short on secrets. We're just finally ready to tell them. So from all of us here, thank you for being part of this, for listening, for feeling, for staying. Until the next one, stay curious, stay grounded, and never stop asking what's just behind that closed door. We'll see you in the next story.